Michael Harrison walked into that courtroom on Tuesday morning like he owned the world. 63 years old, worth $47 million, his 24-year-old girlfriend Jennifer on his arm, wearing a smile that said he'd already won. His wife Sarah sat across the aisle, broken and defeated after 26 years of marriage, or so he thought. But Judge Patricia Coleman held an envelope in her hands that would destroy everything Michael believed about his life, his children, and the empire he'd built. Inside that envelope were DNA test results that would prove Michael Harrison wasn't just a cheating husband. He was something far worse. A man who had stolen another man's life, raised another man's children, and built his fortune on the biggest lie in family court history. What happened next would make national headlines and change the way we think about paternity, betrayal, and the ultimate price of deception. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 questions would haunt this courtroom and captivate America for months. First, how does a man raise 3 children for over 2 decades without knowing they aren't biologically his? Second, what drives a woman to keep such a devastating secret for 26 years of marriage? And third, when the truth finally comes out, who pays the ultimate price, the deceiver or the deceived? This is the story of Michael and Sarah Harrison, a couple whose divorce proceedings would expose a web of lies so complex that even their own lawyers couldn't have prepared for what was coming. This is the story of how DNA testing turned a simple custody battle into the most shocking paternity case in modern American legal history. This is the story of how one envelope would destroy not just a marriage, but everything 2 families thought they knew about love, trust, and blood. Michael Harrison's story began like so many American success stories do, with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work 18-hour days. Born in Detroit to a factory worker and a seamstress, Michael learned early that money meant security, and security meant everything. By 25, he was selling insurance door-to-door in suburban Michigan. By 30, he owned 3 insurance agencies. By 40, he'd expanded into real estate development, and by 50, Michael Harrison was worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. But success, as they say, can be a lonely business. Sarah Williams was 22 when she met Michael at a charity gala in downtown Detroit. She was working as an event coordinator, putting herself through business school at night while supporting her aging mother. Sarah was the kind of woman who lit up a room without trying, intelligent without being intimidating, beautiful without being vain. Michael was immediately smitten, and Sarah saw in Michael the stability she'd never known growing up in foster care. They married 8 months later in a ceremony that cost more than most people's homes. The early years were everything a marriage should be. Michael worked tirelessly to build his empire while Sarah managed their social calendar and charitable commitments. She was the perfect wife for a man with political ambitions, well-spoken, elegant, and genuinely caring about the causes they supported. When Sarah became pregnant with their first child, Marcus, Michael was over the moon. He'd always wanted a large family, something he'd never experienced growing up as an only child. Marcus was born in 1997, a healthy baby boy with his mother's dark eyes and what everyone assumed was his father's strong jaw. 2 years later came the twins, David and Emma, and Michael's family felt complete. He was a hands-on father despite his demanding schedule, coaching Marcus's little league team, attending every school play, and making sure his children understood the value of hard work and education. Michael Harrison might have been demanding in business, but at home he was devoted. Sarah threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else. She volunteered at the children's schools, organized neighborhood fundraisers, and somehow managed to keep their household running smoothly while Michael traveled for business. From the outside, the Harrisons looked like the American dream personified. A successful businessman, a devoted wife, 3 beautiful children, and enough money to give those children every opportunity life could offer. But marriages, like buildings, can develop cracks that aren't visible from the outside. By 2015, as the children entered their teenage years, those cracks were starting to show. Michael's business demands grew heavier, requiring more travel and longer hours. Sarah felt increasingly isolated, managing teenage crises and household responsibilities largely on her own. They began to drift apart in the way that many couples do after decades of marriage, not from any dramatic event, but from the slow erosion of daily neglect. The beginning of the end started with a smartphone notification. In March 2020, just as the world was shutting down due to the pandemic, Michael was working from his home office when Sarah's phone, charging on the kitchen counter, lit up with a message. It was an innocent moment that would destroy everything they'd built together. The message was from someone named James Patterson, and it simply read, "Thinking about you today. Hope you're staying safe." Michael might have ignored it, might have assumed it was just a friend checking in during uncertain times, but something about the intimacy of the message bothered him. When he opened Sarah's phone, using the passcode he'd known for years, he found months of text messages between his wife and James Patterson. Not just friendly check-ins, but intimate conversations that painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for years. James Patterson, as Michael discovered through his own investigation, was Sarah's first love. They dated through high school and into college before Sarah met Michael. James had married someone else, moved to California, and built a successful career as a software engineer. But he'd never forgotten Sarah, and apparently Sarah had never forgotten him. Their affair had begun innocently enough through social media reconnection in 2018, but had evolved into something much deeper. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Michael, feeling betrayed and humiliated, demanded explanations that Sarah couldn't provide. She admitted to the emotional affair, but denied any physical relationship. Michael didn't believe her. How could he? The messages spoke of meetings, of stolen moments, of a love that had apparently never died. Sarah's tearful apologies and pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears. Michael's pride, his sense of control, his very identity as a successful man who had everything figured out, had been shattered. But Michael Harrison was not a man who simply accepted defeat. He was a businessman, accustomed to solving problems through strategy and leverage. If Sarah wanted to destroy their marriage, he would make sure she paid the price. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in Michigan, a woman named Catherine Mills, who was known for her ruthless tactics in high-stakes divorce cases. Michael's strategy was simple. He would prove Sarah was an unfit mother, limit her access to their children, and ensure that her infidelity cost her dearly in the settlement. Sarah, meanwhile, retained her own attorney, a compassionate but tough lawyer named Robert Chen, who specialized in protecting the interests of betrayed spouses. But Sarah's legal strategy was complicated by her own guilt and shame. She genuinely loved her children and was devastated by the thought of losing them. But she also knew that her actions had consequences. The affair, even if only emotional, had broken something fundamental in her marriage. As the divorce proceedings began, Michael's confidence grew. He had evidence of Sarah's affair, he had significantly more financial resources, and he believed that any judge would see Sarah as the villain in their story. He began planning his new life, which included his relationship with Jennifer Walsh, a marketing consultant he'd met through business connections. Jennifer was everything Sarah was not, young, ambitious, and impressed by Michael's wealth and success. The divorce proceedings that began in late 2020 quickly became a battlefield. Michael's attorney, Catherine Mills, was relentless in her attacks on Sarah's character. She painted Sarah as a disloyal wife who had destroyed her family for selfish reasons, a woman who didn't deserve custody of the children she'd neglected while carrying on her affair. Sarah's attorney, Robert Chen, fought back by highlighting Michael's own neglect of his family, his workaholic tendencies, and his quick rebound relationship with a woman barely older than his own daughter. But the case took an unexpected turn when David Harrison, the younger of the twins, now 24 years old, approached his mother with concerns about his father's behavior. David had always been the most perceptive of the three children, and he'd noticed things over the years that bothered him. Michael's explosive temper when challenged, his need to control every aspect of his children's lives, and most disturbing, his complete inability to show genuine emotional connection with any of them. David's concerns led Sarah to seek counseling with Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a family therapist who specialized in helping families navigate divorce. During these sessions, Dr. Rodriguez began to notice patterns in Sarah's stories about her marriage that troubled her. Sarah described a husband who had always been emotionally distant from his children, who showed little natural paternal instinct and who seemed to view his family more as possessions than as people he genuinely loved. More troubling were Sarah's memories of Michael's reaction to each of his children's births. While most new fathers show immediate bonding behaviors, Sarah recalled that Michael had seemed almost detached, more interested in the accomplishments of having children than in the children themselves. Dr. Rodriguez, drawing on decades of experience, began to suspect that something deeper was wrong with the Harrison family dynamic. The revelation came during a particularly intense therapy session in January 2023. Sarah, pushed to examine her deepest feelings about her marriage, broke down completely. Through tears, she revealed a secret she'd carried for over 25 years. The children, Marcus, David, and Emma, were not Michael's biological children. They were the children of James Patterson, Sarah's first love, and the man she'd recently reconnected with. The story Sarah told was heartbreaking in its complexity. In 1996, just months before her wedding to Michael, Sarah had spent one last weekend with James Patterson. It was meant to be closure, a final goodbye before she committed her life to Michael. But that weekend had resulted in pregnancy, and Sarah, young and terrified, had convinced herself that the timing made it possible that Michael was the father. When Marcus was born with features that could have belonged to either man, Sarah chose to believe what was easiest. 2 years later, when Sarah discovered she was pregnant with twins, she knew the truth. She and Michael had been having problems conceiving, and Sarah had secretly reunited with James during a conference in Chicago. The twins were definitely James's children, but Sarah was trapped in a life she'd built on a lie. She couldn't tell Michael the truth without destroying everything they'd created together, so she buried the secret deeper, convinced herself that love and care mattered more than biology, and tried to be the best wife and mother she could be. Dr. Rodriguez, bound by client confidentiality but deeply concerned about the implications, strongly encouraged Sarah to reveal the truth. The deception had poisoned Sarah's marriage from the beginning, creating a foundation of lies that had made genuine intimacy impossible. Sarah's affair with James wasn't just about reconnecting with a lost love. It was about reconnecting with the father of her children, a truth she'd denied for decades. But Sarah was terrified. Revealing the truth would not only destroy any remaining relationship with Michael, it would devastate her children. Marcus, David, and Emma had grown up believing Michael was their father. They'd inherited what they thought was his work ethic, his values, and his expectations for their own lives. Learning that their entire identity was built on a lie would be traumatic beyond measure. The decision was taken out of Sarah's hands when David, concerned about his mother's emotional state, shared his worries with his siblings. Marcus, now 26 and working in his father's business, was furious with his mother for what he saw as her betrayal of their family. Emma, 24 and recently graduated from law school, was more sympathetic but equally confused about how to handle the situation. The three siblings, united in their love for both parents despite the divorce, decided they needed to know the whole truth. It was Marcus who suggested DNA testing. As the oldest, he felt responsible for protecting his younger siblings and understanding what was really happening to their family. The siblings agreed to private DNA testing, initially just to confirm their relationships to each other and to put to rest any doubts about their parentage. What they discovered changed everything. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, exactly 3 years after Michael had first discovered Sarah's text messages. Marcus opened the envelope in Emma's apartment, with David looking over his shoulder. What they found was not what any of them expected. The tests confirmed that all three siblings were full siblings, sharing the same biological parents. But neither of those parents was Michael Harrison. The revelation hit the three young adults like a physical blow. Everything they'd believed about their identity, their heritage, and their family history was false. The man who had raised them, disciplined them, paid for their educations, and shaped their values was not their biological father. More shocking still, their mother had maintained this deception for their entire lives, allowing them to build relationships and identities based on a fundamental lie. Marcus's reaction was immediate and explosive. He felt betrayed not just by his mother but by life itself. Everything he'd worked to achieve in his father's business, every value he'd inherited, every aspect of his identity as Michael Harrison's son was suddenly meaningless. David, always more introspective, was devastated by the implications for their father. Michael had loved them, raised them, and sacrificed for them, never knowing they weren't his biological children. Emma, with her legal training, immediately understood the massive implications for the ongoing divorce proceedings. The siblings made a pact. They would confront their mother together and demand the complete truth. No more lies, no more deception, just the honest story of how their family had been built on such a massive foundation of deceit. The confrontation took place at Sarah's temporary apartment on a Sunday afternoon in late March. Sarah's reaction to her children's discovery was complete emotional collapse. For 26 years, she'd carried the weight of her secret, always terrified that this day would come. When faced with her adult children demanding answers, Sarah finally told the complete truth. Yes, James Patterson was their biological father. Yes, she'd known from the beginning. And yes, she'd made the conscious choice every single day for over 2 decades to maintain the lie. But Sarah's story was more complex than simple deception. She'd been young, frightened, and genuinely in love with Michael when she married him. The weekend with James had been an emotional mistake, a moment of weakness when she was already committed to building a life with Michael. When she discovered her pregnancy, she genuinely hoped Michael was the father. When the children were born, and she knew the truth, she was trapped between destroying the life she'd built and continuing a lie that seemed to be hurting no one. Sarah explained that she'd tried to leave Michael several times over the years, but each time, she'd been stopped by the knowledge that revealing her secret would destroy not just her marriage, but her children's relationship with the man they saw as their father. Michael had been a good father in many ways, providing for them, supporting their dreams, and giving them opportunities they might never have had with James, who had struggled financially for years. The recent affair with James hadn't been planned as an affair at all. James had reached out through social media as a friend, but their connection had reawakened feelings that Sarah had buried for decades. Talking to James again had reminded her of who she'd been before she became Mrs. Michael Harrison, and that person had been happier, more authentic, and more truly herself. Marcus, David, and Emma left that confrontation with more questions than answers. They were angry with their mother, confused about their feelings toward Michael, and curious about James Patterson, the biological father they'd never known. But they were also united in their belief that Michael deserved to know the truth. Whatever his faults as a husband, he'd been their father in every way that mattered, and he was about to lose his children based on a lie. The decision to reveal the truth to Michael was not easy. The siblings knew it would destroy him, but they also knew that continuing the deception would be even more cruel. They agreed that Emma, with her legal background, would approach Michael's attorney with the information. Catherine Mills would know how to handle the revelation in a way that protected everyone's interests, while ensuring the truth came out in court. Catherine Mills had been practicing family law for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the phone call she received from Emma Harrison on April 3, 2023. Emma's revelation that she and her siblings were not Michael's biological children changed everything about the divorce case. Mills immediately understood that this information would devastate her client, but it would also fundamentally alter the legal proceedings in ways that no one could predict. The decision of how to handle the information was complex. Mills had a duty to her client, but she also had ethical obligations to the court. The DNA evidence was not just relevant to the divorce proceedings, it was potentially the most important evidence in the case. Michael's entire strategy had been built on proving that Sarah was an unfit mother who didn't deserve custody of his children. Learning that they weren't his biological children would change his priorities completely. Mills scheduled a meeting with Michael for the following day. She decided to break the news gently, preparing him for what she knew would be the most devastating moment of his life. Michael arrived at her office confident and relaxed, expecting to discuss strategy for the upcoming court appearance. He'd been looking forward to his day in court, the moment when he would publicly vindicate himself and punish Sarah for her betrayal. The conversation that followed was brutal in its simplicity. Mills presented the DNA evidence methodically, explaining what the tests showed and what they meant. Michael's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a kind of numbness that Mills had seen before in clients who had received life-changing news. Michael sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes, processing the implications of what he'd learned. When Michael finally spoke, his first concern was for his children. Despite his shock and devastation, his immediate instinct was paternal. He wanted to know if Marcus, David, and Emma were okay, how they'd discovered the truth, and what they were going through emotionally. Mills was struck by the genuine love in Michael's voice when he spoke about the children, even knowing they weren't biologically his. But Michael's next questions revealed the depth of his devastation. He wanted to know how long Sarah had known, whether she'd ever planned to tell him, and why she'd allowed him to love and raise children who weren't his. Mills couldn't answer those questions, but she could see the profound sense of betrayal and loss in Michael's eyes. Everything he'd believed about his life, his family, and his identity as a father was crumbling around him. The legal implications were staggering. Michael had no biological claim to the children he'd raised, no legal standing to seek custody, and no grounds for demanding child support from Sarah. In fact, if he chose to pursue the matter, Sarah could potentially demand repayment of child support he'd never actually owed. The divorce case had become a completely different legal matter overnight, but Michael surprised his attorney with his response. Despite his devastation, despite his anger at Sarah's deception, Michael made it clear that he still considered Marcus, David, and Emma his children. He'd raised them, loved them, and shaped their lives for over 2 decades. Biology might determine DNA, but it didn't determine love. Michael wanted to maintain his relationship with the children if they were willing, and he wanted to handle the legal proceedings in a way that protected them from further trauma. The court appearance, scheduled for the following week, took on a completely different character. Judge Patricia Coleman had been briefed on the new evidence and understood the sensitive nature of the situation. When Michael walked into the courtroom with Jennifer on his arm, he was no longer the confident businessman seeking to punish his unfaithful wife. He was a man whose entire world had been turned upside down, trying to navigate an impossible situation with dignity. Sarah sat across the aisle, knowing that her secret was finally out and that the consequences would be severe. She'd lost her children's trust, her marriage was irretrievably broken, and she faced an uncertain future. But there was also a sense of relief in finally having the truth revealed. The weight of carrying such a massive secret for so many years had been crushing, and its removal, however painful, felt like liberation. Judge Coleman handled the situation with remarkable sensitivity. She acknowledged the unusual circumstances and the emotional trauma all parties were experiencing. Rather than proceeding with the original divorce hearing, she ordered a recess to allow all parties to adjust their legal strategies based on the new information. She also ordered family counseling for everyone involved, including the children, to help them navigate this unprecedented situation. The media attention that followed was intense, but handled carefully to protect the privacy of the Harrison children. The story of a decades-long paternity deception during high-profile divorce proceedings captured national attention, but responsible journalists focused on the legal and ethical implications rather than the personal details. The case became a touchstone for discussions about paternity rights, the importance of honesty in marriage, and the complex nature of modern families. James Patterson, the biological father who had been unaware of his children's existence until Sarah contacted him during the divorce proceedings, found himself in an equally impossible situation. He'd loved Sarah since high school, but learning that he had 3 adult children he'd never known about was overwhelming. James flew to Michigan to meet Marcus, David, and Emma, but the meetings were awkward and emotional for everyone involved. The children's reaction to meeting their biological father was mixed. Marcus remained angry and confused, struggling to understand how his entire life had been built on deception. David was more open to building a relationship with James. curious about the genetic and personality traits they might share. Emma approached the situation with legal pragmatism, understanding that James was as much a victim of the deception as anyone else. Over the following months, the Harrison family worked through their trauma with professional help. Michael continued his relationship with his children, who gradually came to understand that their feelings about him hadn't changed even if their biology had. He was still the man who had taught them to ride bikes, helped with homework, and supported their dreams. DNA might not make him their father, but love and 20-plus years of parenting certainly did. Sarah's relationship with her children was more complicated. Marcus remained largely estranged, unable to forgive what he saw as a lifetime of deception. David eventually rebuilt a cautious relationship with his mother, understanding that her choices had been motivated by fear and love rather than malice. Emma, with her legal background, was perhaps most understanding of the impossible position Sarah had been in, but she also struggled with the implications of building her entire identity on a lie. The divorce was finalized in December 2023, with an unusual settlement that reflected the extraordinary circumstances. Michael retained significant involvement in his children's lives despite having no legal obligation to do so. Sarah received a modest settlement, far less than she might have expected in a traditional divorce, but also avoided the potential legal consequences of her deception. The children inherited from Michael's estate as if they were his biological children, a decision he made to ensure their futures remained secure. The Harrison case raises profound questions about the nature of family, truth, and love that continue to resonate long after the legal proceedings ended. What makes someone a parent? Is it biology? Or is it the daily act of raising, loving, and sacrificing for a child? Michael Harrison spent over 20 years being a father to children who didn't share his DNA, but his love for them was no less real or meaningful because of their biological origins. Sarah's deception, while devastating in its scope, was motivated by complex emotions that many people can understand if not forgive. She was a young woman who made a mistake, then found herself trapped in a lie that grew larger and more complicated with each passing year. Her attempts to build a happy family while hiding such a fundamental truth created the very problems she was trying to avoid, poisoning her marriage with the stress of constant deception. The children at the center of this story faced perhaps the most difficult challenge of all. Marcus, David, and Emma had to reconstruct their entire sense of identity while maintaining relationships with multiple parental figures. They discovered that love and biology don't always align, that family can be both more and less than what we assume it to be, and that the truth, however painful, is ultimately more valuable than the most comfortable lie. James Patterson's experience highlights another aspect of the modern family crisis. He learned that he had 3 adult children he'd never known about, children who had grown up with another man as their father. His relationship with them would always be complicated by the decades they'd lost and the reality that Michael, not James, had been there for all the important moments of their childhood and adolescence. The case also raises important questions about deception in marriage and the long-term consequences of maintaining fundamental lies in intimate relationships. Sarah's secret didn't just affect her relationship with Michael, it affected every aspect of their family dynamic. The stress of maintaining such a massive deception likely contributed to many of the problems in their marriage, creating emotional distance and preventing the genuine intimacy that healthy relationships require. From a legal perspective, the Harrison case has become a landmark example of how DNA evidence can completely transform family law proceedings. Courts across the country now reference this case when dealing with similar paternity revelations, and it has influenced legislation regarding the rights and responsibilities of legal versus biological parents. The media coverage of the case sparked national conversations about truth in relationships, the definition of fatherhood, and the impact of genetic testing on traditional family structures. As DNA testing becomes more accessible and common, cases like the Harrison divorce are likely to become more frequent, forcing our legal and social systems to adapt to new realities about family, parentage, and identity. Perhaps most importantly, the Harrison story demonstrates the resilience of love in the face of devastating revelations. Michael's continued commitment to his children, despite learning they weren't biologically his, shows that the bonds formed through daily care and emotional connection can be stronger than genetic ties. The children's gradual acceptance of their complex family situation shows that young people can adapt to even the most challenging circumstances when supported by love and professional guidance. The story also serves as a cautionary tale about the cost of deception in relationships. Sarah's well-intentioned lies created decades of problems that ultimately hurt everyone she was trying to protect. Her experience suggests that difficult truths, however painful in the short term, are usually preferable to comfortable lies that poison relationships from within. As we reflect on this extraordinary case, we're left with challenging questions about our own lives and relationships. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What secrets might be hiding in our own families? Are there truths we're avoiding because they're too difficult to face? The Harrison family's experience reminds us that even the most stable-seeming families can be built on foundations that are far more complex than they appear. The case continues to influence legal proceedings, family therapy practices, and public discussions about modern parenthood. Michael Harrison still maintains close relationships with all three children, attending graduations, family celebrations, and important life events. Sarah has rebuilt her life and eventually married James Patterson, finally living honestly with the man she'd loved since high school. The children have grown into successful adults who understand that family is defined by love, commitment, and shared experiences rather than just shared genetics. Today, as genetic testing becomes routine and family structures become increasingly complex, the Harrison case serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us about the long-term consequences of deception in relationships while inspiring us with examples of love that transcends biological boundaries. It challenges our assumptions about family while affirming the power of commitment and forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. The ultimate question raised by this case isn't whether Sarah was right or wrong to keep her secret, or whether Michael was justified in his initial anger and pursuit of revenge. The ultimate question is what we can learn from their experience about building honest, loving relationships that can withstand even the most challenging revelations. In a world where truth is increasingly difficult to hide, the Harrison family's journey suggests that our capacity for love, forgiveness, and adaptation may be far greater than we imagine. What would you have done in Sarah's position, faced with an impossible choice between devastating honesty and protective deception? How would you react if you discovered that everything you believed about your family was built on a lie? These are questions that the Harrison case forces us to confront, questions that have no easy answers, but demand our honest consideration. Because in the end, we're all just trying to build families based on love. And sometimes love requires us to navigate truths that are far more complicated than we ever imagined possible.